Well, I began writing when I was at college, but in my first year of teaching, which was in North Africa, in Algeria, in the desert, in the Sahara Desert, I started publishing stories in the Irish press, Irish Times. And one of those, a couple of those got into anthologies of Irish short stories, and one of them was reviewed by Anthony Burgess, who wrote Clockwork Orange, and who was a really well-known writer at the time and still is. And so that got me on the kind of publishing cycle quite early on. We're talking about 1977 or thereabouts, 78. And then I published the first novel, which I don't really like, a couple of years later. And then later still started writing poetry, or at least publishing poetry, and published three collections of poetry in English in various places over the years. And then one bilingual selection of poems that came out with Wolfbach about 3 years ago here in Switzerland. And for a long time, I was pretty much engaged with poetry. And then about 6 years ago, I published The Gilded Chalet, which was a kind of non-fiction book, travel book, about Switzerland and about various writers who'd spent time in Switzerland over the years. And that did quite well and was well received, and went into paperback about a year later, and an American edition at about the same time. And since then, I've been working on a biography, and in some translations, a biography of the Swiss writer Annemarie Schwarzenbach. And I'm coming to the end of that now. So that's
if you could just tell us a little bit about the Gilded Chalet, like how did that sort of come about?
I wrote an initial piece about Patricia Highsmith, I seem to remember, who was a crime writer and who lived in the Ticino part of Switzerland, thinking to turn it into a newspaper feature. And then I got going on that, and then I did another one, and then by then I thought I could perhaps assemble these into a book. So I looked at the idea of a whole bunch of writers who over time had spent considerable parts of their lives here and published about Switzerland. And it wrote itself rather quickly, actually, within a year. And towards the end of the project, I approached an agent, and an agent recommended a publisher who had already brought out a book about Switzerland by Deacon Buse called Swiss Watching. And he liked it. He liked it within a week, and we went on from there, really. I think it grew out of my interest in writers and in writing short biographies, kind of potted biographies. And so that was the interest there.
Can you share, like, I know you've got many sort of stories within this, but maybe like one of your favorite stories that came out of your research?
Nabokov is one of my favorite writers, and I came to Nabokov early, not to Lolita, but one of his other books, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, when I was in my last year at school, I think, or first year of college. So I've always been a great Nabokov fan, and I really enjoyed going down to Montreux, where he lived for, I think, the last 15 years of his life. He earned quite a lot of money from the screenplay of the film by Stanley Kubrick of Lolita, and so could live in a certain amount of luxury in the Palace Hotel in Montreux. And he's buried above that in Clarens. And so it was a kind of pilgrimage for me, really, to go there and go to his grave and discover a little bit more about him, and to wander around the park behind the hotel where he spent quite a bit of time. So Nabokov is definitely associated with Switzerland, and in particular Switzerland's grand hotels. I went back to writing a bunch of poems about the experience of teaching at home, but also the experience of living under lockdown. And Caroline took quite a few of them. She took about 5, I think, for the site Right Where We Are Now, which is a kind of record of the lockdown in poetry. And one of them I wrote, it's called Sunlight on Plaster. And it's a kind of reflection on teaching, really, and on knowing that one is leaving teaching, that a career comes to an end. And in my case, it's a long 44-year career in teaching, and reflecting a little bit on that in time of lockdown. So it's called Sunlight on Plaster. I should perhaps explain that putlocks are those metal bits that join two spars of a scaffolding together. That's what a putlock is. It kind of locks the scaffolding together on a building. Sunlight on plaster. A sound of putlocks falling into buckets next door as scaffolding comes down around the new building, emerging into sunlight. A child's breast removed. Gangplanks shouldered by workmen in boiler suits, thick gloves and masks. All through the lockdown, as I taught at home, this crew laid brick on brick, mortared stone to stone. Teaching is scaffolding taken away, a building standing tall on its own over them. So I'm a bit wary of bringing my writing life into the classroom. Nonetheless, I have done so over the years in different contexts. You see behind me, for example, a whole range of articles that I put together when I was a journalist with the Bangkok Post and working freelance for airline magazines in the 80s and the 90s. So they've been on my wall if students so choose to read them, I suppose. And occasionally I did share that poem with them when we came out of lockdown, just to give them an idea of what various people do in lockdown. And I do try and give them a real life picture of how writers put things together and approach imagination, because certainly in academia, and school is very much part of academia, there is one idea of how writing comes together, but it is only one idea, and it tends to be falsified somewhat by the needs of academia and exam systems and getting into college and all that business. So, but that is only one part of it. Lots of people do write for pure pleasure, and I do. So I like to draw their attention to that. But I have shared my work with students just a little bit sotto voce.
Lastly, if you could, you mentioned you had nearly finished your latest book and then it'll be coming out soon. Could you just maybe tell us a little bit about that one and what your plans are for the publication?
At the moment, I'm looking for an agent who will pick it up, because it's a difficult subject to sell, really, to an English language audience. Annemarie Schwarzenbach was a Swiss writer, very much of the 30s. She was a morphine addict and died rather young at the age of 34. She actually died from falling from her bicycle in Sils Maria. And she was a traveler and wrote a lot of travel journalism, in particular her journeys around the United States in the 1930s, looking at the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal. And she was really attractive. She was very, very much a kind of Berlin figure. She was lesbian. She tended to dress fluidly. And so her life was colorful, and she hung around with the children of Thomas Mann, Klaus and Erika Mann. And all her work is in German. It hasn't really been translated into English, apart from 3 or 4 pieces that I've done myself of her journalism mostly. So it's been a long project, about 1.5 years at this point, of research in various libraries and in various archives and translation from German. And I remember the distinct memory I have is of the beginning of the lockdown last year at Fastnacht, when I had arranged to go to the Monacensia Library in Munich, where the Mann family archives are kept, and I knew that there was material about Annemarie there. And I went during the Fastnacht break, just as COVID was coming into force, and people still thought that there was no necessity to wear masks. And I spent 3 or 4 wonderful days in this archive looking at these old diaries that somebody had kept from the 1930s. Somebody who was pro-Nazi, actually, and I was looking forward to the 1933 diary coming up. And of course, when I got to that diary, there was nothing in it. The person had, if you like, censored their own diaries after the war. So I spent a wonderful time there doing research into the 1930s and the Nazi era. And at the end of it, the archivist who had been working with me, looking after me, I remember she didn't shake my hand. She sort of clicked her heels, really. And I had a pair of white gloves to consult these rather old documents, and I gave her back the gloves, and she said to me, well, you can keep the gloves. You might need them. That was, for me, the beginning of lockdown. I remember driving back from Munich to come back to school after 3 or 4 days there. And the motorways were almost empty. And it was that time that there had been a kind of COVID hotspot in the Austrian Alps at Ischl, I think it was. And there was the possibility that the Swiss and Austrian and German borders would close. And so I wasn't quite sure that I would get back into the country, but I did make it. But it was a kind of dramatic way to start a little bit of research. Very much a passion project. It's nearly finished now. I know there's 10 chapters in it. It's looking like about 140,000 words, which is a 400-page book. So I have to cut down some of it. And lately I've been having wonderful conversations with people with a professor in Italy who's editing Carson McCullers' letters, and we've been doing a sort of back and forth research thing about various letters. Yeah, I have enjoyed it very much.